now. Centre for London is the dedicated think tank for the capital, the only one. We develop new solutions to London's critical challenges, and we advocate for a fair, sustainable and prosperous global city. We publish research, we stage events online these days, we convene and we influence. Coronavirus has now killed at least 10,000 Londoners. And London's economy is in something like an induced coma. As this crisis plays out, it's also laying bare hidden problems, highlighting stark inequalities and revealing the fragility and interdependence of much of the infrastructure that supports us. For most of us, lockdowns kept us home. We're told to avoid public transport if we can. We don't know yet how long lockdown will last or what the lasting impact is going to be on our transport systems and our behaviour. We have seen, though, relatively speaking, a bit of an uptick in cycling and walking, largely, it seems, for leisure and exercise. And since early May, we've witnessed extraordinary temporary measures on our pavements and streets to help us stay distant and adapt to this upside-down world of what you might call public transport last. I mean, I'm amazed even putting those words in the same phrase. So what does this all mean for the future of transport in London? I'm here to discuss these issues today. I'm really pleased to be joined by a brilliant panel, I hope you'll agree. We've got Alex Williams from Transport for London, we have Pat Brown from Central, and we have Dipti Patel from the London Borough of Ealing. I'll give them a bit more of an introduction as we come to them later on. In terms of the format of the event, I'm just going to first present a few findings from some very recent research that we've been publishing over the last 24 hours. We'll follow with our speakers who will share some insights. We'll get a bit of a discussion going, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I cannot promise, I'm afraid, that we're going to be able to cover all the questions. In our experience, we get lots of great questions, and it's difficult to try and get through all of them. We'll try and get to the ones that are best representative and obviously the most useful to the debate. You can ask questions on Zoom if you're in the Q&A function. You can also ask questions on Twitter if you're following via YouTube using the hashtag LDNResponds. That's hashtag LDNResponds. Also use the same hashtag for any related tweets. And we're going to try and do all this and wrap it all up by 5 p.m. So firstly, I'm just going to do a bit of our research, some very quick highlights. If you want to see more from this research, go to the Centre for London website. So we've been working with LEDNet, the London Environment Directors Network at London Councils, and the pollsters Savanta Comres to have a look at how Londoners' views on transport have been affected. So I'm just going to put up my slides. Hang on, where are we? This should come up. So this first slide shows how people are using transport differently in lockdown, and we'll be hearing more about this, I'm sure, from Alex from TfL. So two key features to look at. The first dark blue spike shows that the only mode that's gone up in any way over this period is walking or running. We seem to be taking our mandated daily exercise. Second, as anyone who knows the city at the moment or has been watching the news will know, public transport use has dropped massively. Just as an example, 65% of Londoners report using the tube either a lot less or having stopped completely. Next, we asked how easy or difficult it is to socially distance on different transport modes for those that are still using them. Here's what we found. Easiest, unsurprisingly, is going by car. That's this light blue column you see here. Put those together, and it's easy for about 4/5 of Londoners. Next up comes walking or running. About 3/4 of us find that easy to socially distance, and cycling not far behind at 70%. We can see here too that respondents say they're struggling to distance on buses and tube. This is despite the fall off, the huge fall off in passenger levels. Around between 40 and 50% are struggling on those modes, and about 40% say the same about taxis and ride hailing. So we've seen a raft of measures introduced quite rapidly to make moving around the city easier during this crisis. So we decided to test their popularity. We found that temporary pavement widening is supported by a full 69% of people. Not far behind that is the widening or increasing cycle lanes, which is supported by 64%. Similar, closing roads and changing parking spaces, supported by 59%. We went on to ask how many would support these measures being made permanent of the pavement and cycle lane changes, and a majority that supports on both these sides. The one thing in here which isn't a current measure, but could be, face masks, has a very high level of support. This yellow bar you see here, combined with this one here, is a total of 73% in favour of making face masks mandatory on buses, tubes and trains. The mayor's been very keen on this, but hasn't made it compulsory yet, despite having the power to do so. We also asked people how easy they find it is to socially distance in different settings, so different places. And 42% say they find it difficult to socially distance on high streets, and even on side streets and in parks. Over a quarter are finding social distancing difficult. And this was taken, this survey was taken in the middle of May, so a few weeks ago now, when it was probably easier to socially distance being outside. Finally, looking ahead, we asked people about their view of transport after the lockdown. We tested a few scenarios, and here's a snippet from the most optimistic unlock scenario, and that's where all restrictions are lifted after or within 3 months. We asked if they thought they'd be using different modes more or less. And the most striking thing here is the level of Londoners saying they will use public transport less. In the 40% region here, people saying they will use public transport less. This is once all measures have been removed. There's also a not far off decline expected in taxis and ride-hailing apps. The good news is that many of the converts to walking, running and cycling in lockdown expect to see, we don't know how accurate they'll be, these good habits persist in the post-lockdown period. The bad news is that many also expect to use their cars more. I'll stop there, and I'm going to hand over to someone who is far more learned in these matters and can share a bit more on the view from Transport for London. So over to Alex Williams, who is Director of City Planning.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. That was very interesting to look at that, and I'll refer to some of that as I kind of go through my my kind of 5-minute slot. So I suppose as an introduction to us, you know, our world has been turned upside down in terms of us being a public transport body that or Strategic Transport Authority that is about promoting public transport to doing the exact opposite, to say, actually, we don't want you to use our network. So, we've done that clearly in response to the pandemic, in response to that public health crisis, and we're working very closely with government on this whole approach now as we move through and hopefully into recovery now. The thing that strikes me though is that it's had a profound effect on our city, and it will take a long time to recover and turn things around. One of the things that strikes me is that when government make an announcement, there's often a bit of a panic about some instant return to the network or some instant change in people's behaviour. For example, the schools going back on Monday, and in reality, people are very cautious and very nervous about changing those and coming out of lockdown. And I think it is going to take a very long time to return to what life was like before. It's also had a profound effect on our business as an organisation, the TfL. The reality is our business model is broken. We were relying around 80% of our income is on movement in terms of fares or congestion charging or advertising that's related to people going through our networks, and that has evaporated. We really do need government support to keep the show on the road. And I think we've got a deal for the next 6 months, but we will need a deal for a longer period as well. It's probably worth me kind of going through some of the kind of figures about where we are in terms of what's happening on the network, in terms of how London has responded. So tube ridership at the moment is around 9% of norm. And I think it's probably worth thinking that in the context. Normally, this day of the week, we would carry around 4 million people. 4 million trips on a tube network. Today, we'll carry between 300 and 400,000 people on the network. So a hugely reduced volume. That volume that is using it is very peaky. A big peak in the morning at 7 or 8 a.m. as people are going to work, and a similar peak at 5 to 6 p.m. But in the interpeak period, we are operating with very low levels of patronage. I was on a train last week with my face mask ready to put on. I was the only one on the carriage going into work. Coming home, there were a few more, but it was very few people. The contrast to that is the road network, where the numbers on the road network are around 80% of the norm. So traffic flows have reduced, and at the peak of the pandemic, it was around 60% of the norm, but they're now up to around 80% of the norm. So we do have a concern that we are in a kind of car-led recovery, and that is a concern, and that's why we turned the congestion charge back on the 18th of May, and we're looking to extend the scope of the scheme for the 22nd of June. The one other change that's happening in terms of ridership and activity is cycle hire is up. It's 20% higher than normal. So we're doing around 40,000 trips a day. So it's around a tenth of what the tube is carrying, which is quite an interesting statistic. You think it's actually quite a small area, but it does show that at the moment, with the fair weather and with the advice not to use public transport, people are using that network in central London a lot, and it feels as a Londoner that the pavements are busier. There's a lot more cyclists out there, but also a lot more cars out there as well, actually. In terms of what we're doing in our services, we reduced services down to a kind of weekend service at the start of the pandemic, and taking advice from government now, we are pushing those up as high as we can. The tube is around 80% of normal service levels at the moment, and we're going to get it up as high as we can to as near as possible to 100% as we can, as soon as we can. We are, we're not a machine. We are operated by people, and our people are affected by the pandemic. 43 have sadly lost their lives during this pandemic. Others are unwell or self-isolating or shielding people. So getting up to that 100% is a challenge going forward, but we are working with government and National Rail to kind of increase that as we go forward. So as we enter recovery, a key part of recovery is to be mindful that our capacity is very limited. With the 2 metre social distancing rule, the capacity of a tube is around 15% of the norm. And on a bus, we can probably get up to around 20% or just shy of that. So the advice is very much don't use public transport. If you do use it, think about using it at other times when it's not so busy. Wear a face mask. And we've also enhanced our cleaning and put in hand sanitizers out there on the network to try and give people confidence if they do have to use it. It is clean. There is also clearly advice on walking and cycling, and a lot of emphasis on that, and a lot of opportunities there as well, actually, in terms of walking and cycling. We are seeing an increase in cycling, as I said earlier. I'm also trying to provide more space on the highway network through the London Street Space programme to widen footways and put more cycle lanes out there. So in the last few weeks, we've had 15,000 square metres of space being created. So we've taken away carriageway and created footway space or cycle lanes and some really kind of fast delivery of projects. The Park Lane cycle lane is a good example where someone thought about it on a Tuesday and it was delivered at the weekend. Now, we've never done that kind of pace of delivery. I don't think the boroughs have ever done that pace of delivery, but that's the era we're in where we're looking at some pretty radical change, but delivering that quickly. And a lot of work with the boroughs on that. So there's a lot of investment from government direct to boroughs through TfL to get that temporary reallocation of road space for people walking and cycling, really. So that is a big opportunity here, and we're really keen to see how we can get that delivered. The final thing I'd say is one of the things none of us know is what this means for the longer term. And yeah, you could have a scenario which is a very quick bounce back to norm, but you could also have other scenarios where London is more at risk, and the growth is or the investment in transport is reduced, and the growth has to be accommodated on even more congested networks. You could see a very different change in behaviour. I think you've got a much more kind of local London at the moment, but you also could well see a bigger commuter belt as a result of this, a kind of more what we call a kind of remote revolution, really, where if people commute in less, they may all choose to commute from further afield as well, really. So one of the things we are looking at is what are the various scenarios that we should be thinking about for how we plan the city. You know, we've got the London plan being completed and being locked down, but we also almost need to start thinking about the next one in some ways, and what are the different kind of travel and development scenarios we need to think about for the city we live in. So that we are looking at that. We don't know the answers to that, but we are planning and thinking about that going forward. For me, I've had my 5 minutes really, but it's had a profound effect, but it is going to take quite a bit of time to turn around, I think.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's super useful to hear, and it's extraordinary, quite the sort of scale of the variables you're having to manage, both now and thinking about the future. Dipti, I wonder if I could bring you in now, if that's okay with you. So Dipti Patel is Director Place Delivery in the London Borough of Ealing and Vice Chair of LEDNet, the Environment Directors Network, who we've been working with on this project. Dipti, are you, if I can hand over to you, that would be great.
Just unmute myself, sorry. Okay. So I'm going to start with Ealing perspective as a West London borough in terms of what we've been doing. The current crisis and associated lockdown has created an unprecedented new requirements on our streets alongside the rest of London. We have seen extraordinary reductions in private car journeys, but we are seeing post that lockdown, seeing an increase of that, as Alex has already said. But conversely, an exceptional number of high number of people using active travel modes, and as a result of the reduced public transport capacity, or just to get exercise, especially in local neighbourhoods and town centres, but also our parks and open spaces, especially where alternative spaces to socialise have been closed. With normal funding streams for transport measures suspended, we, like all other London boroughs, are pursuing alternative funding to implement changes very quickly in order to maximise public safety that benefit our residents, our businesses and the local economy. Active travel is the most effective way to travel that facilitates social distancing, whilst also helping with the climate crisis. In terms of poor air pollution in Ealing, that's been reduced during the lockdown by on average 25%, and we know that that's a similar, or greater position across London already. Ealing, like many boroughs, are already implementing new measures from temporary footway extensions, particularly where we're seeing queuing outside shops in really difficult narrow pavements, or our destinations such as our parks and open spaces. We're creating and improving cycle lanes, which is a key priority for us, both in terms of adding new ones, but adding light segregation to existing lanes. But we do think that needs to be supported by a programme of cycle training to build confidence in users. Bus lane hours are also being extended to help with segregation of cycling from the general traffic. And with the easing of lockdown around schools, we need to increase temporary measures around schools, 2-metre markings and footway extensions around keep clear signs. I think all of this, from my perspective and the council's perspective, does need to be supported by a robust and quite strong communications programme to inform residents and businesses that we are promoting active travel and to encourage shopping and spending within our local economy. Boroughs across London are continuing to work with their communities and businesses and government on a phased lifting of the lockdown restriction to be managed in a safe and controlled recovery. Transport, as we all know, is an important factor in ensuring we continue to control the virus, which is why London and the boroughs are advocating for people to work from home and continue to do so where they can, to walk or cycle where they need to get to. And this is supported with some emergency measures that have been put in by boroughs. Over the coming weeks, more people will be returning to work, and we are already seeing that with schools. And local boroughs are at the heart of ensuring that this is done safely. The good news is that people's behaviours have changed in a relatively short space of time, and we need to build on that. But there is currently more opportunity to opening that change. We need to capture this positive behaviour change for the long term beyond the current crisis, which I think can be difficult, but we need to really take this as an opportunity. I think one of the things is about, how we reprioritise our funding. And as I said before, cycling and training remains an issue of concern, and actually enabling local people to be more confident when they are cycling. Streets will need to be repurposed, and we've started that across boroughs to create more space for walking and for cycling in the short term. And this has happened quite quickly and continues to be, and we do need to redefine our streets for the longer term. We need to avoid returning to pre-existing arrangements, particularly in terms of high traffic levels, which will be a huge challenge as people are now getting back into cars, but also a key element of the council's response to climate change. And I think that's critical, and in terms of supporting green recovery as well. As we know, the research was funded through LEDNet, and this does provide a great opportunity to better understand people's behaviours and make positive impact on the city's transport network once lockdown is over.
Dipti, thank you very much. It's great to hear the kind of borough view. It sounds like you're making great strides on active travel and the like. I mean, sort of in a word, are you very worried about the kind of resurgence of car use in the borough? It sounds like that is the case.
It is, and it is quite a concern at the moment because of the fact that people aren't using public transport. So the easier option at the moment is to be getting in the cars, and we need to try and use that, trying to deter people from doing that. And it's a challenge. It really is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, lastly, before we get onto a kind of more discursive and moment and the Q&A, I want to bring in our final panelist. So Pat Brown is Director of Central and has, I'm sure she won't mind me saying, has long been a key figure in thinking about and planning for and actually implementing a better London. Pat, I wonder if you could give us your reflections on the crisis in terms of transport in London, what, you know, maybe the kind of short-term impacts are going to be, and where might this take us, and how deep is it really? You know, how big is the hole we're in?
Great, thanks very much. And it's super to hear everybody else's contribution. I want to start by saying I really feel for Alex and Transport for London and transport agencies right across the world, because it's an impossible job. The point of transit is that they are mass transit agencies, and that's because they move masses. And here we are encouraging people not to travel on them. And it's quite extraordinary. And as Alex said, it is a broken business model at the moment. And I think nobody's got all the answers, and I certainly haven't. I think one of the biggest issues for London has been the success of Central, of its success of being able to draw lots of people into the centre. It exists really, and you know, I'll come on to this more, to sort of to bring commuters. There's so many commuters that come in on a regular basis, and whilst there is definitely a shift between cycling and walking, it seems to be only working while we're encouraging people not to come into work and stay at home. And cycling in over a long distance or walking over a long distance is not tenable, and it doesn't suit everyone's purposes, nor of which is a moment. So how do we square this as we actually come back to towards what normal is, the $1 million question? And that's one that the likes of Alex is grappling with. That said, and we've already heard this from Dipti and Alex, you know, the positive in this is around behaviour change. We've achieved virtually overnight what we have been trying to do over the past 25 years, which is nudge people, more and more people, to more sustainable modes. And when doing so, the people who made these changes to walking and cycling or simply staying at home actually saw very dramatic results incredibly quickly, especially around air pollution, improved air quality and reduced noise pollution. And that has been a thing that has sustained Londoners as we've actually been, people have been in lockdown. So that's a positive, because by showing them that lived experience of what you can gain by moving towards a sustainable mode, it helps us to make longer term decisions about how we move in the future. And we've done a real-time experiment, which we've not previously been able to do. So crises have their benefits. In 2005, in the terrorist attacks then, a lot of people who had to walk home on 7/7/2005 commented that they didn't realise how easy and how quick it was. So they actually started to walk more frequently. It was that very thing that helped us to get across the business case for our connected wayfinding system that we'd been struggling with, Legible London, and more boroughs came to the table as a consequence of that. I have to say, Alex, when you were at Camden, you were always on the side of the angels on that one. So it was a positive benefit. So we've got to look at positive benefits on this. And it's fantastic that the boroughs and TfL have speedily made more space for walking and cycling. But we have to also be really much more joined up than we are normally. We have to keep the city moving commercially. We have to not impair deliveries, buses and taxis. And I want to talk about taxis for a moment, because I think TfL are too ambivalent about taxis. I do think black cabs are a vital part of the transport mix, and I'm disappointed to see where they are in some of the current plans. You can not only use that if you are a person with impaired mobility, you know, and we have to really think about impairments and mobility issues in all of this, but you can stick a bike in the back of it if you want to be able to commute for longer distances and only do part of it for your site, only part of it as a cyclist. If we want people to walk, we need to make it easy for them to stop. to rest. One of the things that I was disappointed in is the fact that we haven't made as much progress as we could have done in the types of seating that we've got across our city to encourage walking for longer distances, confident in the fact that you'll be able to sit down. Again, it's for people who don't have complete, who just can't walk for 5 miles without sitting down. We have to think of everybody's needs. Another benefit is obviously making the cycling the everyday that we're talking about here, which itself is a virtuous circle. The more it becomes everyday, the less it belongs to the mammals and the speed freaks, the more there's going to be more everyday people using it. And you will see more long-term adoption by a broader section of Londoners. Now, TfL and the boroughs have been struggling with that for a very long time, so that could be a positive. And as we plan for this medium and long term, and Alex has talked about planning, we can't be driven by the cycling agenda and the cycling evangelicists, can't say that word. It's not for everyone, and neither are electric scooters. We've got to consider the experience for all Londoners, and we must also iterate. Changing where we see issues. Let's not make one person's benefit in this new approach somebody else's inconvenience. Something that drives me utterly mad is that when we had the terrorist attack on the bridges 3 years ago, we put the temporary barriers there. The temporary barriers are still there, and on quite a number of central London bridges, all the bus stops are still closed 3 years on. So let's go back quickly and look at what isn't working and iterate, so it's a positive experience for all. And continuing on the theme of positivity, I would like to see 3 things that come out of this as we plan for the future. The constraints do flag up the dominance of central London, and some of the solutions suggested are very central London focused, and we have to think beyond zone 2 to the outer boroughs, to the inner, the outer inner and the outer boroughs. And whilst I think, central London is definitely suffering dramatically, it's actually showing where people live. It's busy in the outer burbs and it's so much quieter in central London. And that will continue for quite some time, even as shops open. There will be distancing in shops, and come June the 15th, how many people will come back is not yet known. It's the centre of our entertainment world, it's our centre of our shopping, but we will have to think beyond not just this crisis, but whether that, going back to your business model, Alex, whether that was the right business model anyway. Was it already a busted flush in this time when it was already overcrowded to go into central London? How do we actually use this to reset the way we work, the way we shop, actually broadening the day so we're not all going in. It is peaky throughout the day, to pick up your phrase, Alex. And we have people starting work at 7 o'clock in the morning, people finishing work at 10 o'clock at night, and just living and working very differently the way we are at the moment. We also have to look at the way we plan to be multimodal. It is ridiculous when the DfT are actually promoting cycling, that when they specified the new Great Western trains, they specified 2 cycle spaces per 5-car set. How bonkers is that when you look at Denmark and you see the way they actually use their trains to take huge amounts of bikes in order for people to do multimodal commutes. And then in terms of other things that we know that we need to do, we need to accelerate towards away from this centrist situation we find ourselves in, to a polycentric way of planning, what Paris is now calling the 15-minute city, with walkable, cyclable, sustainable neighbourhoods that help people live well in a way that addresses our climate emergency. Dipti's referred to this already, which has to be another essential focus as we plan for our future. And on that note, I'll stop. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Pat. That was rich indeed with thoughts and ideas. I'm going to go straight to questions from our participants, just because I know there's going to be good ones and there'll be plenty to get through. So I may direct these specifically to individuals, or feel free to jump in if you want to comment. So the first one comes in and is asking about who's dealing with, and Pat, you mentioned this, the kind of conflicts that everyone's talking about. They say we can't have more of everything, we don't have the space. Who's looking at, so I guess that's one point, those trade-offs and conflicts. And who's looking at how we, and this is my words, how we rehabilitate public transport and start encouraging people back, because we're going to need to.
Shall I start? In terms of who's looking at conflicts, well, the boroughs are, and we are, both of us wearing our kind of highway authority hats. And I just think that every time you look at a scheme design, you are making a judgment call about the balance in terms of the allocation of space. But I do think one of the interesting things is going to be, for me, is that once these temporary measures have been in for a bit of time, is there an appetite to make them permanent? And I think, yeah, certainly when I look at some of the ones that are implemented in where I live in Camden, they look, they're well designed, and they're proportionate. The area still functions, and I can well imagine that when we come out of this pandemic, which hopefully is soon, people will say, well, why are you taking that away? Why don't you make that permanent, really? So we are certainly looking at that issue, but I just think that issue about balancing priorities and whether black cabs have access or they don't is just something you consider for every single scheme. The other point was raised about is getting people back on public transport. I think that's a really big issue, because I think your slides highlighted it really, and I think the number one issue that we have to crack is actually the perception of feeling safe, because people are not using it because we've told them not to use it, and they're too scared to use it, and they're not going to return in any large numbers, regardless of what people say about returning to work or returning to school. They will not come back onto our network unless they feel safe. I think that's a huge issue that we have to crack, but we have to work in lockstep with government on that. We will work with them on the advice on not using public transport, but also work with them on the advice about when it is safe to do so, and when they need to come back. But it's a key issue for the recovery, in my view, is because if you think about changes we're putting in now, they're all quite tentative, small steps. But come September, with all schools potentially going back and other people expecting to go back to work, that's when you have to reconsider that messaging on public transport and what is the appropriate level of social distancing or level of face masks and other things that go with it.
So
Okay.
another question's come in. Thanks, Alex. I'm going to just carry on trying to crack through some of them. Has the survey or any of the follow-up engagement looked at whether businesses are preparing for more flexible working patterns in the long term? And if so, whether the changing transport dynamics are factoring into that thinking? I'll just say, from my point of view, we did sort of explore this a bit from a Londoner's perspective in our polling. And there is definitely an expectation amongst a fair chunk of people that they will be working from home more. I can't comment on businesses' preparation. I think this is one of those huge variables that anyone involved in transport planning is having to chew through a bit at the moment. Any comments from anyone?
I don't know if Pat wants to go first, or
You go first.
I think it's inevitable, and I think there's a kind of cost imperative to do that. I speak as someone who's never worked from home before this crisis. Now I realise the IT kit works, and I can be just as productive at home on Zoom or MS Teams or things like that. I will probably do it more often, and I just think one of the things we've got to grapple with as TfL is, we have 3 head offices. We had 4 recently. We've reduced to 3. Will we reduce to 2? And I just think that several other organisations around the city will be thinking the same thing, really. How do you consolidate more and save money more with people working from home? Because I think the days of everyone coming in every day of the week a working week to work, I just think those numbers are going to dwindle. I think more and more people will mix and match between working from home a bit of the time and being in work for other bits of time, really.
Okay, thanks, Alex. A question now, maybe I think to Dipti, because it's very, on the street local, and we've heard some of this in our research already. So the question is, what about allocating street space to non-transport activities, e.g. pubs and restaurant customers? There's pressure to reactivate the kind of social economy, if you like, but that is at tension with giving pedestrians space potentially. Dipti, do you have a view?
Yeah, I think that's something that we are generally going to be looking at. I think it's part of the economic recovery in our town centres. How do we support those local businesses? How do we create spaces to be social outside? And so we're starting that discussion. There will be challenges because space is going to be at a premium to manage that. But I think that it will be on a much more local basis. How do we work with those local businesses to create that sort of space? So I think it will vary in different locations.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, there's a couple coming on bike lanes, but before I go to those, one about demand management. So probably for Alex, but Pat, you may have a view too. How can we use data apps to increase, to support the increase of use of public transport for, spreading the peak, for example?
I think we need to look at that, definitely. I think, and certainly in terms of the retail reopening on the 15th of June, we've been sharing a lot of information with those retailers to say, these are the peaks in your areas, please avoid those peaks. The difficulty you've got is that it's very easy to provide information about what the normal set of behaviour is on a network and say, I don't know, Oxford Circus Station is busy at that time in the morning and busy at that time in the evening. What we are not able to do is provide that real-time live information about how busy a train will be, because we don't have access to that data in real time. And that's one of the challenges we've got, is that you think like Stratford Station, that's got 10 lines on it, you might get 3 trains arriving at the same time and everyone wanting to get on the Jubilee line. Now we can't, we might have said to people, well, it's not too busy at 10, but then at a point in time, it could become really, really busy. That's part of mass transit, really. You get these kind of surges at certain times that are very difficult to manage.
Are you then exploring, sorry, Alex, are you so therefore exploring ways to get that data? No, how might you innovate to be able to give real-time information on transport?
I think the network is just so fluid. I think that's probably a step too far. But I think having genuine information to say, Stratford, the busiest time at Stratford is actually 7 a.m. in the morning. But I think we can provide more information to retailers, potentially station users, to say, avoid this station at these times if you're going to use it at all. So I think we certainly need to do more on that, and we are looking at that in terms of how we engage businesses. But whether we can use apps to do that, I think that, certainly we'd look at that, definitely.
I'd like to say I think it's tricky, as Alex has said, but I think one of the things we are going to have to get used to for the foreseeable future is making appointments for things that we once did spontaneously, like having to make an appointment to go shopping in the store that we want to go shopping in, for example. And I suspect there's got to be, in certain parts, some form of public-private sector response where we actually understand what the overall pattern of use of that place is. And we won't be able to predict it precisely, but start to actually think about what, the spreading the flow, the spreading the times we use our cities, as I was referring to in my earlier introduction, so that we don't necessarily have real-time apps, although I do think some people are working on this in other cities. But we actually have confidence to know if we're going into a store, we won't be all going into the same place at the same time.
Yeah. Okay, question now on bike lanes. The question is, when will London see proper segregated bike lanes? Proper bike lanes that stretch to the outer boroughs where most people live are essential in the view of the questioner. Any views on that? So long distance segregated lanes.
Well, they are going in. I think this mayor has, I think it's tripled the extent of segregated cycleways in London in his term. And he wants to do more. And what's
Does that
good.
include the outer boroughs, Alex?
Yeah, it stretches out. I mean, you think about one of the ones being, the two that are being implemented at the moment, C4 and C9. C4 is going out to Greenwich, C9 is going out to Hounslow. And we want to do more of that, and we are very aligned with government on that as well, actually. So I think this is one of the areas where there is an opportunity to do more and to get some of these cycle lanes in with temporary materials, and then come back and do them on a permanent basis. So some of those spokes, of London, looking at all of those and trying to get some more of those cycle lanes in. That's certainly what we're looking at. Absolutely.
I think,
sorry, go on.
I think it goes back to my point about seeing the evidence of behaviour change. I think bike lanes are often opposed by people because they fear change. Now we're seeing really positive benefits of actually a modal shift. And hopefully for boroughs like Ealing, it will be an easier sell. If you think about the effort that Waltham Foster in to getting the mini Holland through, that was so difficult, so political, and it's been one of the best things that's happened to the borough. So that would be a way forward.
And I think one of the things I wanted to add was just that the cycle lanes got to be looked at on a much more regional basis, sub-regionally. So moving out to London, how the major cycle lane that we're looking at, Hounslow, how does that connect with West London generally? So people maximise uses of that. So I think there's an opportunity to look at that in a much more regional basis, so we can see more people get from one borough to another much more easily.
And just while we're on the kind of cycling out of boroughs, area, Pat, you've already mentioned e-scooters. You'll know I'm a bit of an advocate for new types of micromobility. Do you have a view, any of you, across, e-bikes, e-scooters, and how they might contribute to moving Londoners around in the future?
I put that in for you, especially Rob.
Thank you.
I think somebody's criticised me for saying I was pitting evangelicals, I can't say it again, cyclists against mobility impaired Londoners, and I wasn't saying that. My point is that in all of this, we need a blend, and we need the modes to work for all. As you know, Rob, I promoted something called the Movement Code some time ago, which Centre for London has been championing as well. And so we make sure that our movement and our city belongs to everyone, and we share it well. So I think e-scooters and micromobility are absolutely part of the mix, but they shouldn't be a dominant part of the mix.
I think we seem to have lost Pat. Oh no, Pat, you're back.
No, yeah, I heard, yeah.
Oh, very good. Maybe it was me. Sorry, Pat, I didn't catch the end of what you said there.
It's part of it. They should be part of the mix, but not. It should be planned to be part of the mix, but nothing should dominate. No mode should dominate.
No, I couldn't agree more. And the movement code, I think, is a kind of key part of how you bring in that vibrant ecosystem.
Absolutely.
I just want to say we've had a couple of questions about the polling specifically, which I'm going to just try and address. One question was whether we can break down our polling by disability. Whether people have disabilities or not. I'm afraid we can't. That's something definitely to look at if we do any extension of this work. We do have some data which we're still going through on socioeconomic class and a few other distinctions like inner and outer London and gender, which we're hoping to be able to report on publicly quite soon. And one kind of tidbit I can offer is women are more in favour, quite substantially more in favour of widening pavements temporarily than men, which maybe isn't surprising. They're probably possibly big users of the pavement space. Right, let's move to another question. Let me get down here. One way to reduce private car use is to reduce the number of on-street parking spaces and reallocate them for active travel and public realm features. Would you agree?
I think that's what's happening. I think if you look at some of the London street space proposals, they are widening footways at the expense of car parking. So, and I think, as I said earlier, one of the interesting things is that a temporary measure, or is that a measure that will become permanent? I think it's happening. But I think the question is probably right. It doesn't. Maybe more of it needs to happen elsewhere across the capital as well.
I mean, in our research with talking to boroughs in particular, there's the inevitable tension between the kind of quality of the temporary scheme and the potential permanent replacement if there were one. I think part of what it reveals to me is that the process we have of consulting and making sure schemes actually do work for different interests is a good one, and we shouldn't throw it out just because temporary measures are needed now. Just a couple of questions. I want to try and get a view from everyone if I can on some very specific questions, one of which I've raised, and that's about mandating masks on public transport. So who of you three, and I realise this might be tricky for you, Alex, but are you in favour of TfL making it mandatory to use face masks on public transport? And I'll ask Dipti and Pat to give their view too.
I think the position on mandating a mask is going to change very soon, actually, probably within the hour, bizarrely enough.
Oh.
And I think that what you've seen is a gradual ratcheting up of the requirement to wear masks. I think initially the advice was they're not needed, but now the mayor has challenged that quite consistently and is now advising them on public transport. But I think we are likely to go to the next stage fairly soon about them being required. I think.
Sorry,
I think
exclusive. Go on, Alex. Sorry.
I think one of the challenges there is that is enforceability and about who's actually going to do that. I'm going to give you a credit example I had about going into work a week or two ago, and I had my mask ready to put on. I didn't put it on because I was the only person in the carriage. And I think usage at the moment is quite low because public transport usage is low. As usage of public transport increases, they actually become more important. So I think having kind of greater clarity and I suspect it will be required and be mandatory. I think that's going to happen anyway.
So Pat and Dipti, in a word, assuming Sadiq announces this within the hour, that's our stop press revelation. Would you support, yes or no?
Completely.
Dipti?
Yes, I think so. I think for reassurance around safety.
Okay, all right, I'm going to move on to some other yes-no ones. Is now the time to pedestrianise Oxford Street? Yes, no from all of you.
No.
No. Dipti?
Yes, I think in part.
Alex?
Absolutely yes.
Very good. I'm going to say yes with micromobility and a movement code. How worried or confident are you, next question, that lockdown will end but social distancing won't? Could mass transit survive that for an extended period, 12, 24 months?
Well, my view is I think regardless of what the rules are, I don't think we're going to get customers back to normal levels for probably a year, maybe longer. And I think what's quite interesting is to look at what's happening in other countries and in other sectors. For example, on the tube, we're expected to have a 2-metre social distancing requirement. You're not expected to have that on a plane. And it's quite interesting in France, SNCF, I think, have just introduced a measure where you can sit in every seat on their trains. Every seat can be full there. So I think it's going to be quite interesting about what the standards are and whether they do change and loosen as lockdown goes. Because the other interesting thing is if masks are mandated, does that also over time lead to a change in social distancing? You know, we have to be guided by the PHE guidance. At the moment, it's 2 metres. And if it does change, then more people can use public transport. But clearly, it's their call first, and we'll respect that as we move forward.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. A couple of last points, last questions. Yes, no one here. This is a very centre for London question. Is now the time to introduce a London-wide road user charging scheme? Quick yes or no? It'll get money for TfL.
Yes.
That's a yes from Pat. Dipti, do you have a view?
I think that's going to be a challenge. So from particularly outer London boroughs.
Okay. Alex?
I think it's probably it's too soon to say now, but I think we need to look at road user charging, definitely.
I want to say not now, but at some point soon. So
yeah, the concern we've got is the car-led recovery, but it feels like it's probably not the right time now. But it's certainly something we need to look at about what are the different ways of paying for roads going forward. Definitely. Yeah,
I mean, the whole of London transport, and this is both at TfL level and London boroughs. I know from talking to colleagues, the financial situation needs immediate attention and major rethinking to survive the short and longer term impacts of this virus. So hopefully we'll see progress on that soon.
Rob, if I may on that, I think, you know, one of the issues for TfL for some time is the more they've actually prioritised walking and cycling, the more they've actually been prioritising something that doesn't pay them. You know, so TfL is predicated on the fare box, yet they're now prioritising things that they've got to pay for and is free. So, you know, we have to think about how we fund our mobility in a very different way in the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
And it's quite interesting. One of the things that's coming out of the funding deal we have with government was to do a review about how we are funded going forward. And I think that's quite a positive thing, actually, because I think the business model we're working on to be completely reliant on fares and no subsidy, that clearly doesn't work at the moment. So I think a more sustainable funding situation for the organisation is something that's worth looking at, definitely. I think that's what other cities are happening all over the world, to be honest.
I mean, I would say, just as a sort of, because Pat and I like to talk about this a bit, the advantage of micromobility is that TfL don't have to pay for the vehicle you're travelling on. People put money in their own pockets to provide for the vehicle. So there is a sort of different financial dynamic across different modes. I'm going to have to wrap up now. I'm just going to say there was one other question about consulting business community in our research. I'm just going to say we are doing that. As best we can, but it's also something that could be for further work, definitely. I just want to say before I wrap up, thank you to everyone that's made this happen in our team. Pulling things together these days is not always straightforward. So thanks everyone at Centre for London for making this happen. I want to thank everyone that's joined the Zoom call, everyone that's contributed questions, everyone that's been watching on YouTube, anyone that's commenting via Twitter or giving us questions that way. We've got through lots of them. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of them. And I want to thank our panel who've been fantastic. I hope everyone will agree. I'm sure they will. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Dipti. Thanks, Alex. I hope we get to have more conversations like this soon. And I really want to thank our very generous sponsors who've made this project possible. Our major sponsors are the London Environment Directors Network, LEDNet, and our project partners, the London Technical Advisors Group. With that, I will close the session. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rob.
Good to see you.